Your military career was basically glorified babysitting teenagers in uniforms. The school board director leaned into his microphone so the insult echoed across the silent gymnasium. I sat in the back row and did not say a word, choosing not to remind him that my version of babysitting once involved loading live explosives onto fighter jets. To understand why I stayed perfectly quiet, and how that exact sentence would eventually force him to humiliate himself on stage in front of our entire town, I have to go back. My name is Elena. I am 48 years old, and for 2 decades my office was the sweltering, jet fuel-scented concrete of an Air Force flight line. I retired as a master sergeant in munitions systems. We were the people who made sure multi-million-dollar aircraft had the precise payload they needed before pushing out into hostile skies over places most people only see on the evening news. In my world, the margin of error was exactly 0. A distracted mind or a skipped step on a safety checklist did not just mean a poor performance review from a manager. It meant a smoking crater where your team used to be. Because of those stakes, you learn a very specific type of calm. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. You learn that panic is a choice, and that facts always matter more than feelings. I spent 20 years managing millions of dollars in highly classified hardware, leading teams of exhausted young men and women through 24-hour shifts in the freezing rain and the blistering desert heat. I knew how to break down a complicated logistical nightmare into manageable pieces. When I retired at age 42, I packed up my life, moved back to my hometown in Ohio, and traded my combat boots for a khaki uniform and a whistle. I took a job as the senior instructor for the high school Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps. The transition was not a coincidence. I had grown up in this exact town, walking those exact waxed linoleum hallways. I took the job not because it was an easy pension gig, but because I knew what it felt like to be a teenager drifting without an anchor. I wanted to take the discipline, the purpose, and the unshakable sense of belonging that the military had given me, and offer it to kids who desperately needed it. If you believe that kind of quiet, steady guidance still matters in the world today, I hope you will stick around for this story. The administration gave me a drafty annex building at the far edge of the staff parking lot. The cinder block walls were painted a dull institutional beige, and the heater rattled constantly. But to my cadets, it was a sanctuary. My classroom was not filled with the kids headed to Ivy League universities. It was filled with the quiet ones, the invisible ones, and the angry ones. Kids who worked night shifts at the local grocery store to help their parents pay rent. Kids who came to school in the dead of winter without proper coats. Kids who had never been told they were capable of greatness. Sometimes leadership is about teaching a perfect marching drill. Sometimes it is about keeping a secret stash of granola bars in your bottom desk drawer because you know half your class did not get dinner the night before. One of those kids was a boy named David. David walked into my classroom 4 years ago with his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor, and a chip on his shoulder the size of a cinder block. Most of the faculty had already written him off as a lost cause, but over 4 years, I watched that angry boy transform into my cadet commander, a young man of profound integrity who eventually enlisted in the Army and deployed overseas. He was the reason I showed up every morning. But to a certain type of person, my classroom was just a waste of square footage. Enter Marcus. Marcus had recently been elected to the local school board. He was a man in his early 50s who had inherited a highly lucrative chain of regional car dealerships from his father, a fact he conveniently forgot whenever he lectured people about being a self-made success. He wore custom-tailored suits to afternoon committee meetings. He loved words like synergy metrics and optimization. To Marcus, a high school was not a community asset. It was a corporate balance sheet. And he did not like anything on that balance sheet that did not look shiny on a real estate brochure. He took an immediate, visceral dislike to the cadet program. During his first tour of the campus, he walked into my annex, looked at the scuffed floorboards, and smirked at a group of sophomores practicing a color guard routine. He did not ask them their names. He simply checked his expensive watch and walked out. To him, I was just a glorified gym teacher, a middle-aged woman babysitting kids who were not smart enough for the robotics club. He assumed I lacked the political savvy to defend myself, and because I did not brag about my past, he had absolutely no idea what I had done for a living before I met him. He confused my quiet demeanor for weakness. It is the most common mistake arrogant people make. They assume that if you are not yelling, you do not know how to fight. But in logistics, we do not yell. We observe. We assess the target. We prepare. The whisper started in late October. Teachers talk, and rumors have a way of traveling fast in a small town. The word in the faculty lounge was that Marcus was looking for a signature victory for his first year on the board. He wanted to fund a massive, state-of-the-art digital media center in the main building, a project that would secure him a giant bronze plaque with his name on it. But to fund his vanity project without raising local taxes, he needed to make severe cuts elsewhere. He needed a sacrifice. I did not panic. You do not react to cafeteria rumors. You wait for the intelligence to be verified. You wait for the actual orders. Those orders arrived on a bitter, rain-soaked Friday afternoon in November. The school had mostly emptied out for the weekend. I was alone in the annex, standing in the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, wiping down the whiteboards and aligning the desks for Monday morning. The heavy drops of rain were beating against the frosted glass of the windows. My old coffee mug, a chipped souvenir from a deployment to Kuwait, sat next to my keyboard. My computer chimed. I walked over to my desk. A notification was flashing on the screen. It was a district-wide email from the superintendent's office, flagged as highly urgent, sent at exactly 5:45. That is the exact time bureaucrats send messages they desperately hope you will not open until Monday morning. I clicked the message. The subject line said, "Emergency public vote on extracurricular restructuring." My stomach tightened. I scrolled down past the administrative jargon, past the budget forecasts, until I found the highlighted section at the bottom of page 3. There it was, printed in stark black and white. Marcus had completely bypassed the standard committee review process. He had scheduled a binding emergency board vote for the following Tuesday night, and he had formally introduced a motion to reduce the funding for the military science and cadet program to $0. Not reduced. Erased. Silence. He really thought I was just going to pack up my boxes and fade away. He had no idea who he had just declared war on. The high school gymnasium smelled of damp wool coats and industrial floor wax. It was Tuesday evening, and the wooden bleachers were packed with restless parents, frustrated teachers, and concerned residents. Outside, a bitter November rain was freezing against the tall windows, but inside, the air was thick and tense. At the far end of the basketball court, sitting behind a long, folding table draped in cheap blue plastic, was the school board. Marcus sat dead center. He looked incredibly relaxed. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, his gold watch catching the harsh glare of the overhead halide lights. He had a silver pen resting perfectly parallel to his legal pad, and he periodically sipped from a glass of water, looking out at the crowd with the serene confidence of a man who already knew exactly how the night would end. I sat in the very last row of folding chairs on the floor. I wore a plain gray blazer, my hair pulled back neatly, my hands resting quietly in my lap. 2 of my senior cadets sat beside me. They were both in their dress uniforms, their brass polished to a mirror shine, their backs perfectly straight. But I could see the subtle, anxious twitch in their fingers. They knew why we were there. They were terrified. The meeting dragged on through the usual procedural announcements. The approval of the previous minutes, the boiler maintenance update, a debate over the cafeteria vendor. It was all a slow march to the execution block. Finally, the superintendent cleared his throat and announced the emergency motion on extracurricular restructuring. Marcus did not wait for the superintendent to finish reading the summary. He leaned forward, adjusted his microphone with 2 fingers, and launched into his prepared speech. He talked about the future. He painted a grand picture of his proposed digital media center using phrases like return on investment, 21st century readiness, and corporate synergy. He spoke about preparing students for the modern economy and how the district needed to make hard choices to stay competitive. Therefore, he explained, they needed to find the money in existing budgets. Then, he seamlessly pivoted to my program. He did not attack the kids directly. He was far too slick for that. Instead, he framed the cadet program as an outdated relic, a dusty antique taking up valuable resources. He cited our declining enrollment numbers from 10 years ago, conveniently ignoring the fact that my classes had been at maximum capacity for the last 3 years. Several parents in the front row began to grumble. A mother of a former cadet stood up and approached the public comment microphone. She told the board, her voice shaking with emotion, how the program had kept her son from dropping out of school, how it had taught him respect, discipline, and given him a sense of purpose when the rest of the world had written him off. Marcus listened with an expression of polite boredom. When she finished, he smiled thinly. "We appreciate your passion," Marcus said, his voice echoing loudly. "But we have to be realistic about our budget. We cannot keep pouring thousands of dollars into a program that offers no tangible modern job skills. Let us be honest with ourselves here." He paused, letting the silence stretch out, making sure everyone was hanging on his next word. He looked past the parents, past the faculty, and locked his eyes directly on me in the back row. "Your military career was basically glorified babysitting teenagers in uniforms." The school board director leaned into his microphone so the insult echoed across the silent gymnasium. I sat in the back row and did not say a word. The gymnasium erupted. Parents shouted. A fellow teacher slammed his notebook onto a chair. The 2 senior cadets sitting next to me turned to look at my face, their eyes wide with shock and anger. They were waiting for me to stand up. They were waiting for me to march down the center aisle, grab the microphone, and demand respect. I did not move. I simply watched him. I studied the smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He wanted me to lose my temper. He wanted me to scream and curse so he could point to me and say, "Look how unstable she is. Look how unprofessional." He wanted a reaction to justify the execution. In the Air Force, they teach you that if you react on emotion when you take fire, you lose the engagement. You never attack a fortified position when the enemy holds the high ground. You retreat, you gather your resources, and you hit them where they are blind. Not because you are afraid. Because facts over feelings wins the war. "Hold your bearing," I whispered quietly to the 2 cadets beside me. They stiffened, swallowed their anger, and locked their eyes straight ahead. Marcus banged his gavel over the shouting. He called for a vote. It was a mere formality. He had clearly whipped the votes in private long before the meeting started. 3 hands went up, then 4, then 5, a clear majority. The gavel fell with a sharp wooden crack. The motion carried. The funding was gone. As the meeting adjourned and the crowd broke into chaotic clusters of arguing parents, Marcus stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked directly at me across the length of the court. He offered a small, victorious nod, a dismissal. I did not break eye contact. I nodded back slowly. Then I stood up, ushered my cadets toward the exit, and walked out into the cold rain. I drove home that night with the radio off, the silence of the car broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green. It was past 10 o'clock. The reality of what had just happened was settling heavily onto my chest. I had a mortgage to pay. But more importantly, I had 50 kids who relied on that classroom as their only safe space. Marcus had taken our travel budget. He had taken our uniform replacement fund. He had taken our supply money. He assumed that by starving the beast would simply lay down and die. He assumed wrong. The next morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray. I arrived at the school at 6:30, long before the first bell. I unlocked the heavy metal door of the annex and flipped on the lights. The room was perfectly still. The state and national flags stood in the corner. The polished drill rifles were locked in their racks, and the whiteboard was wiped clean. At exactly 6:45, I heard a soft knock at the door. I turned. Standing in the doorway was Julian. Julian was a senior. He was a quiet, fiercely intelligent kid who worked weekends hauling scrap metal just to help his grandmother pay for groceries. He was the kind of cadet who showed up early to sweep the floors without ever being asked. He stood there, shivering slightly in the crisp morning air. His uniform was pressed perfectly, the creases sharp enough to cut paper, but his face looked entirely defeated. He was clutching his heavy canvas garment bag in his right hand. "Sergeant," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard. "I heard what happened last night. Do we have to turn our uniforms in today?" I looked at the heavy canvas bag in his hand. I looked at the way his shoulders slumped, as if a terrible weight had just been dropped on him. He fully expected me to say yes. He expected the adult world to fail him just like it had always failed him. I walked over to my desk. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and looked Julian dead in the eye. "Put the bag down, Julian," I said, my voice entirely flat, entirely calm. The school board just cut our supply lines, but they did not disband the unit. The real mission starts right now. In military logistics, when your primary supply chain is completely severed, you do not simply surrender to the enemy. You shift immediately to austere operations. You inventory exactly what you possess, you scavenge for exactly what you need, and you rely entirely on the discipline of your unit. I looked at Julian standing in the doorway of the annex, holding his canvas uniform bag like it was an anchor pulling him underwater. "We are not turning anything in," I told him, keeping my voice completely level. "The school board stripped our district funding. They did not strip our charter. We are no longer an official line item on Marcus's spreadsheet. That means we are now operating entirely off the grid." Julian blinked, processing the sudden shift in strategy. Slowly, he lowered the bag to the floor. The heavy canvas hit the linoleum with a soft, definitive thud. For the next 4 months, my cadets became ghosts in the district financial system. But they became highly visible in our town. When you strip a former munitions officer of their budget, you do not stop them from operating. You just force them to get creative. I applied the exact same logistical framework to our hometown that I once used to keep fighter jets armed in the desert. Ghost operations are less about requisition forms and more about highly organized, deeply polite bartering. We needed funds to cover the dry cleaning of 50 dress uniforms. I could not buy the service. So I took my senior cadets to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall on a freezing Saturday morning. We spent 6 hours power washing their brick facade, clearing their heavy gutters and organizing their storage sheds. When we finished, the post commander quietly handed me a check from their charity fund. It was enough to cover our dry cleaning for the entire semester. We needed money to repair our damaged ceremonial drill rifles. I organized a massive car wash in the parking lot of an old strip mall. But we did not just wash cars. My cadets directed traffic with precise military hand signals, scrubbed tires until the rubber shined, and addressed every single driver as sir or ma'am. We made $800 in one single afternoon. Every dollar was meticulously tracked in a spiral notebook I kept locked inside my desk. Inside the classroom, the austerity measures were even tighter. When we ran out of official grip tape for the rifles, we used standard black electrical tape bought in bulk from the hardware store. I brought 2 industrial irons from my own house and set up a pressing station in the back corner of the room, teaching the kids how to apply heavy starch to get a razor-sharp crease in their trousers. The program did not wither. It hardened. The adversity became a massive point of pride for the kids. They knew they were surviving on their own grit, completely independent of the school board's approval. They marched a little taller. Their uniforms were a little sharper, but a small town is only so big, and word inevitably got back to Marcus. He was absolutely furious. He had engineered a highly public execution at that board meeting, but the body had rejected the grave. He hated the fact that my kids were out in the community, visibly working hard, visibly earning respect. Every time he drove his expensive luxury vehicle past that strip mall and saw my cadets waving signs, it was a glaring reminder that his authority had limits. He assumed we would simply fade away because he held the purse strings. Overconfident people always make that mistake. They assume money is the only source of real power. If you have ever had to fight back quietly while an arrogant person tried to erase your hard work, tell me how you handled it in the comments below. I review every single one. My power came from a small, framed photograph sitting on the corner of my desk. It was a picture of David. David was the angry young man I mentioned earlier. The one who had walked into my classroom 4 years ago, ready to fight the world. When he first arrived, he was failing 3 classes, bouncing between foster homes, and entirely convinced he was destined for a prison cell. It took 2 full years of relentless patience, strict boundaries, and an unyielding dedication to finally break through his armor. When he graduated, he did not just walk across the stage. He enlisted in the Army. He found his anchor. I knew David was currently deployed overseas, commanding logistics for an infantry unit in a highly volatile region. Julian, my current cadet commander, still emailed him weekly updates about the program. Whenever I felt the crushing weight of Marcus and the school board pressing down on me, I looked at that photograph. It was my absolute proof that what we did mattered. Marcus could stand behind a microphone and call my career glorified babysitting all he wanted, but I knew I had built a leader who was currently keeping American soldiers safe. I did not know it at the time, but Julian had recently emailed David about the budget cut. And David, sitting in a sandbagged bunker thousands of miles away, had decided to write a letter. But while that letter was slowly making its way across the ocean, antagonists like Marcus never stop at their first roadblock. When passive starvation fails, they inevitably escalate to active sabotage, and they usually use the bureaucracy to do it. It was late February, and the state military inspection was exactly 3 weeks away. This inspection was the absolute most critical event of our entire year. An active-duty military evaluation team would travel to the school to evaluate our performance, our uniform standards, and our precision drill routines. A failing grade meant the military could pull our charter entirely, effectively shutting us down from the federal level and doing Marcus's dirty work for him. To pass, my cadets needed to perfect a highly complex exhibition drill routine. We needed the massive floor space of the auxiliary gymnasium for 2 hours every single Tuesday afternoon. We had held that exact reservation for 10 years. That Tuesday, I marched my 50 cadets across the snow-covered courtyard toward the auxiliary gym. The winter air was biting, but the kids were focused, their drill rifles resting perfectly on their shoulders. We reached the heavy steel double doors. Julian stepped forward and grabbed the brass handles. He pulled. The doors did not budge. He frowned, gripping the metal tighter, and yanked again. Nothing. I walked up and slid my master key into the lock. It jammed immediately. The internal pins had been completely replaced. They had changed the cores. Then I saw the notice. Taped to the reinforced glass at eye level was a crisp white piece of paper, printed on official school board stationery. It was signed directly by Marcus, acting in his capacity as board chairman. I leaned in to study the fine print. It cited an obscure, rarely enforced district insurance policy. The notice claimed that because our program was no longer officially funded by the district, we were no longer covered by the school liability umbrella for indoor athletic facilities. Therefore, we were permanently barred from using the gymnasium. The closure was effective immediately. Julian studied the notice over my shoulder. The color drained from his face. They changed the locks, Julian said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and rising panic. He waited until 3 weeks before the state evaluation and he locked us out. I stood perfectly still, letting the freezing air bite at my cheeks. I could feel the eyes of 50 cadets burning into my back. They were terrified. They had washed cars in the freezing cold just to afford their uniform polish. And now the floor was being ripped out from under them right before the finish line. Without the auxiliary gym, we could not practice our routine. If we could not practice, we would fail the inspection. If we failed the inspection, the program would cease to exist. Marcus had used a bureaucratic loophole to force us into a corner we could not barter our way out of. He wanted my cadets to stand in the cold and realize that no matter how hard they fought, a man in a suit could simply snap his fingers and lock them out in the snow. I stared at the fresh steel lock, realizing I could not fight a legal district order with a snow shovel. The direct approach had failed. It was time for a completely different kind of maneuver. In logistics, when an obstacle is placed in your path, you do not waste energy complaining about the obstacle. You simply reroute the convoy. I stared at the new steel padlock on the auxiliary gymnasium doors. I did not march down to the district office to file a formal grievance. I did not call the local newspaper. If Marcus wanted my 50 cadets to freeze, I was going to show him exactly how well we handled the cold. I turned around and marched my unit to the farthest edge of the staff parking lot. For the next 3 weeks, we held our exhibition drill practice on the icy, wind-blown asphalt. The bitter February air whipped off the nearby lake, turning the cadets' faces red and their hands entirely numb. They slipped on patches of frozen sleet. They dropped their heavy composite drill rifles, the clatter echoing sharply against the brick walls of the school. But every single time a cadet fell, 2 more were there to pull them back up. We were entirely locked out of the district system, but we were not broken. It was brutal, beautiful discipline. I was not babysitting teenagers. I was forging iron. And when the active duty military evaluation team arrived in early March, my cadets executed their complex routine on that frozen asphalt with terrifying perfection. The senior evaluator, a stern Army major, watched them spin their rifles in the bitter cold. He did not say a single word. When they finished, he walked straight up to Julian, looked him up and down, and handed him a perfect evaluation score. Our federal charter was secure for another year. The immediate threat of the drill space eviction was neutralized. But surviving a battle is not the same thing as winning a war. Marcus still controlled the district budget. If I left things as they were, he would simply find another quieter way to slowly choke the program next year. That is when an unexpected ally initiated a strategic blind drop. Enter Thomas. Thomas was the local Veterans Affairs liaison for our county. He was a retired Navy hospital corpsman, a man with a gravelly voice and a deep systemic hatred of small-town politicians who used veterans as props for their own vanity. Because I handled so much community service work, Thomas and I had become good friends. More importantly, Thomas was the only civilian in town who possessed a complete, unredacted copy of my military service jacket. I had filed it with his office years ago to process routine medical paperwork. Thomas had watched the entire school board debacle unfold from a distance, and most importantly, he saw a piece of mail that came across his desk in late March. It was a thick paper envelope covered in international postage stamps, the return address listed as a military post office box in the Middle East. Julian had emailed David about the budget cuts in the locked gymnasium. David, sitting in a sandbagged logistics tent thousands of miles away, had taken the time to write a formal, handwritten letter. But he did not send it to me. He sent it directly to the county office, hoping they had emergency grant money to save his old program. Thomas sat alone in his office and reviewed David's letter. He studied what my former student wrote about the dark path he had been walking, and how the unyielding standards of my classroom were currently keeping his platoon safe on a hostile border. Thomas did not file a grant application. He decided a simple check would not solve the problem. He decided it was time for a public reckoning. Thomas accessed the federal archives and pulled my official military file. He printed every single page of my 20 years on the flight line. He printed the explosive ordnance handling certifications, the exact dollar amounts of the classified hardware my teams had managed, the combat deployment logs, and the commendation medals. He placed my entire military history into a thick manila folder, placed David's letter right on top, and walked it directly over to the mayor's office. Every spring, our town held a massive civic gala to announce the Veteran of the Year. It was the most prestigious social event in the county. The selection process was handled by a highly secretive independent committee consisting of the mayor and 3 retired military officers. Thomas was the chairman of that committee. He submitted my file, and he did not say a single word to me about it. While Thomas was setting a quiet trap in the shadows, Marcus was busy building himself a pedestal in the sun. Marcus was secretly preparing to announce a run for the state senate in the upcoming fall election. To win, he needed high-profile photo opportunities and the blessing of the local political establishment. The annual veteran banquet in late April was the perfect launching pad. Every wealthy donor, every local politician, and every prominent business owner would be sitting in that room. Marcus used his considerable leverage as the school board chairman to strong-arm his way into the role of dinner committee chair. He desperately wanted to be the master of ceremonies. He wanted to stand under the bright stage lights wearing a custom tuxedo and hand a heavy glass trophy to whatever wealthy retired executive the committee had chosen. He saw the entire evening not as a night of quiet honor, but as a corporate networking event for his own political ambitions. He assumed he was entirely in control. He assumed I was just a glorified gym teacher waiting to be quietly fired at the end of the semester. The night of the banquet finally arrived. The grand ballroom of the downtown hotel was spectacular. 500 guests sat at round tables covered in crisp white linen, drinking expensive wine under massive crystal chandeliers. The local news station had a camera set up on a riser in the back of the room. I attended quietly. Thomas had called me that morning and insisted I use his spare ticket, claiming he just wanted me to enjoy a free steak dinner after a grueling semester. I sat at a small table near the swinging kitchen doors, wearing my formal Air Force mess dress uniform, my miniature medals pinned to my lapel. I drank my ice water and watched the spectacle unfold. At the front of the room, Marcus was completely in his element. He was shaking hands, laughing far too loudly, and checking his reflection in the mirrored pillars. He was ready for his spotlight. 10 minutes before the speeches were scheduled to begin, the mayor pulled Marcus aside near the edge of the stage. The mayor handed Marcus a heavy, dark leather presentation folder. It was sealed shut with a thick gold ribbon and a dark red wax stamp. The mayor tapped the center of the folder with his index finger. His expression was entirely serious. He explained that the committee's choice was a strictly guarded secret this year, and that the element of pure surprise was the entire point of the tradition. Then the mayor gave Marcus one strict, unbreakable instruction. He was absolutely forbidden from breaking that wax seal or looking at the name inside until he was standing directly behind the microphone. The ballroom lights dimmed, and a single bright spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the center stage. 500 guests quieted down and turned their attention toward the heavy oak podium. Marcus stepped out from the wings. He looked entirely in his element. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, and he carried the heavy leather presentation folder casually under his left arm. He walked with the relaxed, arrogant stride of a man who firmly believed he was the most important person in the room. He reached the podium, adjusted the microphone with 2 fingers, and flashed a brilliant, practiced smile out into the sea of faces. In the back of the room, a local television news camera swung its lens toward him, the red recording light glowing steadily in the shadows. I sat quietly at my small table near the swinging kitchen doors. I wore my dark blue Air Force mess dress uniform, my miniature medals catching the faint amber light from the crystal chandeliers above. I took a slow sip of ice water and watched him. I had absolutely no idea what was inside the folder he was holding. Marcus began his speech. It was a masterful, hollow performance. He spoke about civic duty, the critical importance of visionary leadership, and the profound sacrifices made by the men and women of our community. He carefully wove his own upcoming state Senate campaign themes into the preamble, testing his political talking points on the county elite. Tonight, however, is not about politics, Marcus said smoothly, leaning closer to the microphone. Tonight is about honoring the absolute best among us. The selection committee operates in strict secrecy. In fact, even as the chairman of this dinner, I have no idea whose name is inside this folder. But I do know they represent the pinnacle of service. He chuckled softly, looking down at the mayor who sat in the front row with his arms crossed and an entirely blank expression on his face. Marcus picked up the leather folder. He slipped his manicured thumb under the thick gold ribbon and snapped the heavy red wax seal. The sharp crack echoed loudly through the microphone. He opened the cover. From 50 feet away, I watched his face. The transformation was instantaneous. His confident politician's smile collapsed. For 3 agonizing seconds, Marcus stopped breathing. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscles straining in his neck. His eyes locked onto the heavy ivory paper inside the folder, and he blinked rapidly, as if expecting the ink to magically rearrange itself. He looked up at the crowd, his face completely drained of color. He desperately looked toward the front row, locking eyes with the mayor. He was silently begging for a way out. The mayor did not smile. He simply extended his right hand and pointed a single finger directly at the podium. Speak the words. Marcus was trapped. He was standing under a massive spotlight on a live microphone with every single power broker in the county watching him. If he decided not to announce the award, his political career was over before it even began. He had to execute the trap he had just confidently walked into. He cleared his throat. The sound was dry and thin. The recipient, Marcus, began, his voice shaking so badly the microphone picked up the tremor. The recipient of this year's highest civic honor is recognized for 20 years of exceptional service in the United States Air Force. Retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant, serving as a senior munitions systems specialist. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the front tables. This was not the standard biography of a retired local executive or a wealthy hospital donor. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. The recipient. He forced the words out, his eyes darting frantically across the page. Personally managed the logistics, security, and deployment of over $400 million in highly classified precision-guided ordnance. The murmurs grew louder. She commanded flight line operations across 5 combat deployments in hostile theaters. Marcus recited, his voice growing hollow as he choked on the pronoun. Guiding specialized teams of airmen under extreme threat conditions, maintaining a flawless 0% error rate. He was publicly dismantling his own lie. He had looked at me in a gymnasium and called my career glorified babysitting. Now the mayor was forcing him to announce to the county that I had managed more high-stakes capital in a single afternoon than his car dealerships would handle in a decade. But Thomas had not just included my military file. Marcus turned the page in the folder. His shoulders visibly slumped. "The selection committee," Marcus stammered, sweat beginning to shine on his forehead, "has asked me to share a letter submitted in support of this nomination. It was sent from an active duty soldier currently deployed on a hostile border." Marcus took a jagged breath and began to speak David's words aloud. He explained how David had been an angry, lost teenager, failing his classes and heading straight for a prison cell. He detailed how my high school cadet classroom was the only place that offered him structure instead of pity. He writes, Marcus choked out, his voice cracking. "She would not let me fail. She did not just teach me how to wear a uniform. She taught me how to survive. Right now, I am commanding a logistics convoy in a combat zone. The only reason my team is safe tonight is because of the exact, unforgiving standards she drilled into me when I was a teenager." A heavy, profound silence settled over the grand ballroom. The air felt thick, charged with the emotional weight of a soldier fighting for his teacher from thousands of miles away. Marcus reached the final paragraph. "I hear the school board thinks her program is a waste of money," Marcus said, reciting his own exact insult back to the room. "I hear they think she just babysits teenagers. The men and women in my platoon who get to go home to their families because of what she taught me would strongly disagree. I owe her my life. Please ensure her program survives." Marcus stopped. He could not speak anymore. He stared down at the paper, absolutely crushed under the weight of undeniable truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus whispered, utterly defeated, "please welcome the veteran of the year, Master Sergeant Elena." For a fraction of a second, the room was perfectly, breathlessly still. And then Thomas stood up near the front row and began to clap. The mayor stood up next, then the chief of police. Within 10 seconds, 500 people were on their feet. The massive, deafening roar of a standing ovation physically shook the floorboards and echoed off the crystal chandeliers. I sat at my small table by the kitchen doors, frozen. I looked across the room at Thomas. The retired Navy corpsman smiled and gave me a slow, sharp salute. I stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my mess dress uniform. I did not rush. I walked slowly and deliberately through the maze of tables, stepping into the massive center aisle of the ballroom. As I passed, people clapped me on the shoulder and nodded. I felt a heavy sense of validation, not for my own ego, but for David, for Julian, and for every kid who had scrubbed tires and marched on frozen asphalt just to keep our unit alive. I reached the front of the room and climbed the 4 wooden steps to the stage. Marcus was standing completely frozen beside the podium, holding out the heavy glass award. His hands were violently shaking. He could not bring himself to make eye contact with me. He looked entirely broken. He fully expected me to destroy him. He expected me to take the microphone, point my finger at his chest, and tell the entire town how he had locked 50 children out in the snow to fund a vanity project. He was braced for the final strike. I did not strike him. I stopped directly in front of him. I reached out and took the heavy glass award from his shaking hands. Then I turned toward the crowd, stepped up to the acrylic podium, and gently pulled the microphone toward me. The ballroom was entirely silent. 500 people waited for me to speak. I looked down at the heavy glass award resting on the acrylic podium. Then I looked to my right, where Marcus stood frozen under the bright lights. He was waiting for the execution. He fully expected me to leverage the sympathy of the entire county to destroy his political career. I could have listed every cruel obstacle he had thrown at my cadets over the past 6 months, but I am not a politician. I am a retired master sergeant, You do not teach 50 teenagers about honor and discipline if you abandon those exact principles the moment you finally hold the high ground. I leaned into the microphone. I am profoundly grateful for this honor, I began, keeping my voice low and steady. But I cannot accept it on my own behalf. This belongs to the 50 young men and women in my classroom who spent this winter marching on frozen asphalt because they refused to surrender. I heard a soft wave of agreement ripple through the front tables. In the military, I continued, we learn that you cannot accurately evaluate a mission from behind a desk. You have to stand on the flight line. You have to feel the heat of the engines. True leadership is not about destroying the people who underestimate you. It is about guiding them until they understand the work. I turned my body and looked directly at Marcus. He flinched. Mr. Chairman, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. Managing a district budget is incredibly difficult work, but numbers on a spreadsheet can never capture the reality on the ground. So before you make any future decisions about the value of my cadets, I want to make a public offer. I extended my hand toward him. Next Tuesday morning at 6:30, my unit will be conducting morning physical training. I invite you to join us. I invite you to stand in the cold and watch them work. Come see exactly what kind of future leaders we are building. I did not yell. I did not humiliate him. I simply set the parameters of the engagement and stepped back. Marcus looked at my outstretched hand. He looked at the mayor. He looked at the local news camera in the back of the room. He had absolutely no choice. He stepped forward, forced a very tight smile, and shook my hand. The crowd erupted into applause again. They thought they were witnessing a beautiful moment of civic unity. They had no idea they were watching a complete, unconditional surrender. The next Tuesday morning, the April air was sharp and bitter. Marcus actually showed up. He arrived at the annex at exactly 6:30, wearing a heavy overcoat. He stood on the edge of the cracked asphalt, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, as my 50 cadets snapped to attention. Julian called the commands. The synchronized snap of 50 composite rifles hitting the ground in perfect unison echoed off the brick walls of the school like a single gunshot. The discipline was terrifying and beautiful. Marcus watched young men and women from broken homes move with the exact precision of an elite honor guard. He did not say a single word for the entire hour. When the morning bell finally rang, he walked over to my desk, nodded tightly, and left. 2 weeks later, the school board held their monthly meeting. There was no grand debate about corporate synergy. Marcus simply introduced a quiet routine motion to restore the full operating budget for the military science cadet program. He cited a recent reassessment of district priorities. The vote was unanimous. We got our supply money back. We got our travel budget back. And the new steel lock on the auxiliary gymnasium was quietly removed the very next morning. Marcus never officially announced his run for the state senate. The local political establishment had watched him attempt to bully a retired logistics officer in front of the entire county, and they quietly withdrew their financial support before his campaign ever launched. I never hung that heavy glass award in my office. I gave it to Julian when he graduated, telling him it belonged to the unit. I kept doing exactly what I loved, showing up every single morning at 6:45, unlocking the heavy metal doors and making sure my kids had a safe harbor before the first bell rang. Sometimes justice does not require you to burn the village down. Sometimes true victory is simply neutralizing the threat and returning to the mission. Overconfident people rely on noise. They rely on titles and budgets and microphones. But quiet competence will always outlast loud arrogance. When someone underestimates you, you do not owe them an argument. You gather your resources, you hold your bearing, and you wait for the undeniable truth to speak on your behalf. Not because you are weak, because facts always outrank feelings. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If you believe that discipline, grit, and real leadership are still the most important things we can teach the next generation, please hit the subscribe button. It helps this channel grow, and it tells me you appreciate stories of quiet, earned justice. And I would love to hear from you in the comments below. If you were handed that microphone on the stage, would you have taken the high road and invited him to class? Or would you have let the town know exactly what he did? Let me know. I look forward to reading your thoughts. In our next video, a demanding boss tries to terminate an older warehouse worker to save money, completely unaware of what the man keeps in his locked toolbox. I will see you then.